Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. So my name is Monier. I'm part of the product management organization at Axway. And I've been spending the last 4 to 5 years with customers, partners, prospects, implementing API platforms within small to large enterprises. And I'm really happy to be here today and share with you some of the key findings on how to make an enterprise API platform a success. What are the key success criteria, and what are the key things you need to care about in the initial phase of your design and in the implementation phase. And before I go into the implementation and the technical aspects, I'd like to start with the business aspects of API platforms. Airbus was a great example just before, but I'd like to pick an example that is from the B2C world because it's easy to understand. It's not necessarily representative of what our customers are doing, but it's really easy to understand and to relate to. With the light bulb. So a light bulb was first introduced 100 years ago. Thomas Edison made the first commercially available light bulb in 1879. And since 100 years, it evolved slightly. We changed the light bulb. We built more efficient ones, built different light bulbs in different sizes, different colors, made low energy light bulbs, but it wasn't really it hasn't evolved much in 100 years. And basically, it's a commoditized market, and actually a pretty boring market when you think about it, until 2012. And in 2012, Philips introduced Philips Hue, which was the first line of Wi-Fi-enabled, color-changing bulbs that you could control from a mobile app. The way it works is that you have a Zigbee protocol that controls your bulbs. You have a bridge that transforms Zigbee to Wi-Fi, and then you have a mobile apps that initially was exposed as an exclusivity only in the Apple Store. It allowed you to do pretty interesting use case. Turn all the lights in a room into one click, on and off. Turn all the lights when you're leaving your apartment off, setting up routines during the day so that the lights change at a particular time of the day, or setting up specific scenes. It got Philips pretty good press and pretty good awareness on the market. It sort of rejuvenated the light bulb market. They got some good articles in the Forbes magazines. They were named the 2012 best products, but at the end, they got good visibility, but it didn't really change the market because they were facing a big issue, which is most people, when they want to turn their light on and on, they don't want to go in their mobile apps, find an app, and then click on the right button to turn their lights on and off. They were really a usability issue to scale. And what was interesting is the second phase of their evolution, where they started to expose APIs so that they support much more use case. So not only the use case that Philips thought about, but any use case where you could flash the light when you receive an SMS, flash the light when you receive a payment on your bank account, turn your red lights to red when your bank account starts to soar, and support many, many use cases. And also change the user experience. Because thanks to API, you can start to expose all the operations that Philips thought about, not only through a mobile app, but also through Alexa, through Google Home, or through the recently released Apple HomePod, and use your voice to turn your light on and turn your light off. So Philips started through their API to leverage an ecosystem around them to deliver more value around their products and to improve the user experience of their products. So it's a simple example of how APIs allows enterprises to deliver innovative products, differentiate, and leverage an ecosystem to change the user experience and their customer experience. And if you translate that example in the financial industry, in the healthcare industry, in the government industry, which is what our customers are doing, you very easily understand how API are, the center of innovation, differentiation, and changing the customer experience, which is, the key business drivers besides speed that organizations are looking for with API platform. And we see a shift in organizations that are successful from being API-centric, where you deliver products, with traditional product lines through various channels. At best, you have an omni-channel or a multi-channel initiative, but you remain, focused on delivering your products through the traditional channel to an enterprise where you really are focused on customer experience, and you try to leverage the services from the organization, but also services that are provided by partners to completely change the way you innovate, the way you differentiate, and your customer experience. And enterprise that we see being the most successful on the business side with the API platforms are really focused on the right side of this diagram, and how to create new product, new services, how to implement new business models. We just had a very interesting set of questions with Airbus. It's a new business model with them. And they need to start thinking about it and thinking how they're going to implement it. Or just simply implement new processes if organizations are focused on operational efficiency. So that's why APIs are important within organizations on the business side. Now I'm going to talk more about the technical side and the implementation side. So to be successful in this type of digital transformation, the first thing you need is API management. Won't be a surprise, and why? Because on one side, you have an explosion of APIs, APIs from existing applications that you want to expose to all these digital channels, but also APIs from your ecosystem of partners that you want to leverage, as well as API from microservices. There's an explosion of microservices. I'll come back to that later in my presentation. And you need to manage those APIs. To do so, you need an API catalog where you version your API, you manage the lifecycle of your API. You need a consumer registry where you authorize consumers to access your API. You need threat detection. You need authentication, authorization. You need to be able to mediate identities that are used in the digital world to identities that are recognized by your existing application, which is extremely important. And you need more and more to rapidly create new APIs. On top of that, you need a good set of analytics and predictive insight to not only understand the SLA, the technical aspects of your APIs, but also the business value of your API. How much revenue am I making with this API? Do I have a churn risk on this API? So all the analytics and predictive insights to try to anticipate and understand the behavior of your users. Analysts call that full API lifecycle management. In fact, if you go in more detail, it goes all the way from planning, creating, governing, consuming, engaging, measuring APIs. That's what full API lifecycle management is. I guess most of you are pretty familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend too much time. What I want to explain next is more what are the key aspects that you need to be careful of when you implement an API platform. And there are really 5 categories. The first one is self-service. And I'm going to explain what in self-service you need to care about if you want to be successful. Second one is DevOps. Third one is rapid API creation. Third one is container. And last one is microservices. They are sort of ordered in the way we've seen them appearing in organizations. Most developers are familiar with all these concepts, but within large organizations, we started to see appearing this concept a little bit in this order. So the first one, self-service. There was really a change this last 3 to 5 years in the way API management is consumed in large enterprises. A couple of years ago, you had an API management team, small team. If I make a parallel with sports, it was a small team, very well trained, being able to deliver APIs at the edge of the enterprise that were secured, right level of performance. They knew their stuff, very well trained, they could be very fast. That was great. But that wasn't scaling. And the trend that we see now is to shift from this model to a model where you have an API explosion within the organization. And you don't have one team, you have 10 teams, maybe 100 teams that are building APIs that you need to manage, that you need to expose securely at the edge of the enterprise. And that's really a shift that we see in the organization. And when you have this shift, the key is self-service, so that you can provide API to the API management, to the API developers in a way that they can consume it, pick it very quickly apply security that is predefined for them, and just run on their race to deliver digital initiatives as fast as possible. So what is self-service? Well, there are two sides of self-service. There is a very well-known side that most vendors talk about a lot, which is the consumer side, where you build a portal, internal, external, you have API discovery, people can discover APIs, you have rich API documentation, you have usage plans and peelings if you want to monetize your API. If you expose your API to a third-party organization, you need partner management to manage the relationship with your partner. You also need things like delegated administration so that you don't need huge teams to cope with a large number of partners, and you can delegate some of this administration. And if you care about your developers, you probably have SDKs that accelerates and secure the consumption of APIs by generating automatically SDKs from the API catalog. That's very well known. Most API vendors have a good coverage on this side, including Axway. Where we see value is on the provider side. And this side is not as well known and not as well understood by customers, by vendors, and we've seen really a shift these last 2 to 3 years that I want to talk about. The first shift when you do a provider self-service is that developers do not need to worry about security. What you need instead is to have a set of generic security policies that have been built with the business sides covering all the use cases that you want to have in terms of API consumption, that have been validated by the security group and that are up to date in terms of applying the latest security, applying protection from the latest security threats. All the way from the OS to the TCP layer to the fine-grained authorization layer. At all these layers, you need to have a good set of pre-built security policies that are automatically applied. Developers shouldn't have to worry about choosing the right security policies within a large organization in particular. Then there's a second aspect, which is a trend that we see at the moment, which is, I believe, quite important, is once you have your dynamic your security policy, the way you enforce them needs to be dynamic. Why? Because API platforms are more and more hybrid. You expose API on the cloud, you expose the APIs on premise, and the security policies that you want to apply on both sides are not the same. Another example is, let's say you have an employee, and this employee needs to consume APIs. When the employee is connected from the LAN, and that's a real-life example that we have from a large bank in France, when an employee wants to consume API internally, he has SSO, it's very seamless, and he has access to all the method he's entitled to given his role. When he does the same operation through the internet, well, maybe SSO is not enough. You want to have two-factor authentication. And maybe you don't authorize that user to do the same operations from outside the LAN because he's connected through the internet and you don't want to allow him to do highly secured operations that he would be able to do from within the walls of the organization. Those are real-life examples, and what dynamic policy enforcement allows you to do is to apply these security policies dynamically, depending on where the traffic is received, and remove that complexity from the API developer. There are many other examples, customers versus employees, or in large deployments where you have an API catalog deployed everywhere in the world, and you don't want to have different implementation of your API catalog. You have an API catalog in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America for latency reasons. Maybe the consumption of your API in different parts of the world is different, and you don't want to apply the same security policies. Those are real-life examples that we've seen from our customers. Once you've implemented that, it's pretty straightforward. Developers don't have to worry about security. They just use standards, Swagger, OpenAPI, specification v3 to register the API. They are automatically virtualized with the right level of security. What's important for these developers, though, is to have the right set of APIs so that you support them in their day-to-day operations, so that it's very straightforward for them to register an API. It seems obvious, but it's not that easy to do. And ideally, have a CLI, because CLI are even easier to use than REST APIs. And then you need to have things like delegate administrations to manage access, to manage metrics, and to manage troubleshooting so that you remove load on your central team and you delegate these tasks to the user of the API platform. On the DevOps, DevOps was mentioned as an important aspect of in the previous presentation. You really have to see DevOps as a loop. I mean, continuous integration, continuous delivery is probably the heart of DevOps, but you really have to think of it as a loop. The way we approach it and what we've seen is that you need to integrate with whatever tool the organization is using. If the organization wants to use GitLab to version their policies, use GitLab. If they want to use Bitbucket instead, let them use Bitbucket. Same thing with API design. Pick the vendor of your choice. In API testing, there are lots of vendors ranging from security testing to functional testing, load testing, and we integrate with all of this. Same thing in the CI, in the release, in the deployments, and then in the infrastructure, whether it's the infrastructure as a service layer, platform as a service layer, or container as a service layer, which is the big trend with Docker and Kubernetes, which we believe is going to be the mainstream in the upcoming 2 to 3 years in large organizations. Of course, there is monitoring tools and collaboration tools you also need to integrate with, but being able to integrate with all these tools is key. Now, that's one key learnings. The other key learning is that, I mentioned it before, but I just want to stress it, having the right REST API and the right CLI so that it's super easy to do all this operation is really key if you want to be successful in your enterprise API platform. And then you want to be granular. Granular means two things. If you take the API layer here, it means being able to deploy APIs independently of each other. And then if you take the layers vertically, it means being able to change the documentation of your API without having to change the being able to change the documentation of your API without having to redeploy the implementation of your API. So separate the doc from the implementation. It seems basic, but if you think about that ahead, you're going to build a much more flexible system that reduces risks and that is, allows you to deploy more frequently and more easily. And then you have to think about the whys. And if you want to break the silos between dev and operations, it's really important. It seems obvious again, but it's really important because you're going to build trust with the operation teams if you have a way to deploy your API without downtime, even if you update an existing API. That's extremely important. And if you build this high availability, auditability, reversibility, and support for elasticity, you'll build the trust with the operation teams, and they will be much less reluctant to having frequent updates and be able to support you in your digital initiatives and be much faster. I'm going to skip this slide because I see that the time is running. The last thing I want to talk about is the trend around microservices. So microservices are spreading like virus in large organizations. There are a pretty simple way to manage microservices with the service mesh concept. If you take Istio, you can apply basic governance to your microservices. But you do need, on top of that, a way to centralize your API and to govern your API. And you should have automatic registration of your microservices into this central plane so that you can govern your APIs. And microservices, they need to be managed. They need to be protected, and you need to apply you need to enforce the consumption model. Sometimes you want to scale automatically. Sometimes you don't want to scale because there's a cost associated with scaling. And if the value of the service that you provide is limited, well, you don't want to scale automatically. So there are different scenarios in terms of governing microservices and API consumptions that need to be applied. And what our view is that you should have a way to centrally manage that easily. And we really see a shift in the enterprise, and that's going to be my last key findings, from managing the APIs at the edge to managing APIs at 3 layers. At the microservice layer, the service mesh concept, at the project layer, or the line of business layer, where you manage the consumption of API built by a particular team internally, and then at the edge of the enterprise. And you need a central way to manage these APIs, and then you need elastic gateways at the external edge, at the project edge, and micro gateways that can coexist with the microservice as a sidecar. That's really the vision of where how microservices APIs can be governed. If you want to hear more about us, you can come to our booth. We have a presentation at 5 p.m. around key success stories and a very nice example around PSD2, of a mobile app and a set of REST API with pre-built security that we've built on our stack. And we have very great partners, Elastic Beam. We just announced a partnership with them on artificial intelligence-based security to complement our security stack. What they do is do behavioral security on top of our solution. It's fully integrated, and we just announced that today, and also Stream Data is a sponsor. So just wanted to mention them, given that they are our partners. And if you have any questions.
We have time for a few questions. We'll do the first one, right? And then again, someone will ask a second question. So the first question is, also about like what you said between. I've seen many companies. I will go on stage. I've seen many companies trying to adopt APIs internally, and IT or business were saying no at some point. So they released the portal for external developers, and the portal, the metric, the management was so great that internal employees were using external APIs for internal projects, right? And I've seen that in many companies, right? But it's not the best way to do it, in my opinion, right? So with your API platform success idea, how today, if you were head of IT or head of digital, how would you convince a CIO or a CTO to adopt APIs directly, not going through communication, external portals, maybe to adopt it after?
Well, it's an interesting question because at the start of the journey, the initial idea is often to build an external portal. But as they start to do their due diligence in terms of value, the first thing that they deliver is often an internal portal. And they first build the internal portal, they learn from that, they expose it internally so that their assets can be easily consumed, so that they have more agility, more speed, and then they build an external portal. So the trend we actually see is internal portal being built first and separate from the external portal and have basically two catalogs, an internal API catalog and an external API catalog, so that you have a portal for more dedicated for internal usage and a portal for external usage. That's what we see.
Yeah. So you see mostly internal before external.
Before external. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. One question here. I took some weight, but I do it.
Just wanted to make you run. Ken Lane, API Evangelist. Thanks for your talk. So recommendations for any startups, you said you want to use all the tools possible when you're in your platform. So if I have a startup and I want to partner with you, what can I do to reduce friction so that you can be using my tool or service as quickly as possible as part of what you offer?
Your question is specifically on DevOps or more generally speaking on the API platform?
Just in general on the platform. If I want to partner with you with my company, what can I do to make that happen fast? What are the things that you see with your existing partners and tools and services that made your job easier to integrate and make useful?
Right. I would start. It depends on your needs, but I would consider two things: either the API catalog itself and the set of REST API we have around it to allow you to have this self-service approach of registering the API, automatically applying the security, and being able to expose these APIs for internal consumption, external consumption. So really the API catalog and the corresponding virtualization of API, these core sets, in a way that is very flexible for your developers. And then I will look at the part that I had to skip in the matter of time, which is more the API builder, which is a way to create APIs very fast that generates microservices, that is fully self-service, that is SaaS-enabled. So if you're a small organization, it's probably where you want to start. You don't want to install a full stack on-premise or in a private cloud. You want to use a ready-to-consume SaaS service. So maybe that's an area where I would recommend to start so that you can start building APIs fast, leveraging our very rapid API creation tool with a cool graphical user interface, a set of connectors that are easily enriched through a marketplace. That may be a good option. But we could talk more to understand your requirements. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much.